The marble was cold under Nova's knees, but she refused to feel it. Around her, 1,000 wolves in their finest ceremonial pelts filled the great hall of the Ashveil Keep, arranged like decorations around the twin thrones where Caius and Julian sat in gold-trimmed glory. Watching her with the same bored contempt a man might show a housefly he hasn't yet bothered to swat. The chains connecting her wrists to the stone floor were silver, a deliberate choice. Everyone in the hall knew it burned Luna-blooded wolves at contact. Everyone in the hall had watched her refuse to flinch. Caius raised his hand. The murmuring died. He leaned forward on his throne, every inch of him constructed for intimidation, the sharp jaw, the cold eyes, the white ceremonial cloak that had never seen a single day of actual war. "Bow your head," he said. His voice carried. It always carried. "Or I'll interpret your defiance as an invitation." Nova looked at him with the same expression she'd worn for 11 months of captivity. Not hatred. Something worse, something that said she had already measured him and found the number embarrassingly small. She did not bow. Julian laughed from his throne, a sound like coins dropping on glass. He opened his mouth to say something, and then something heavy hit the marble. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. The crowd didn't just quiet, they recoiled, a single collective step backward, as the severed head of Commander Aldrich, their unbeatable Commander Aldrich, the man who had never once lost a sanctioned duel, came to rest against the polished toe of Caius's boot. Nova's eyes moved to the dark corridor, and Atlas stepped out of it. He was wiping the blood from his claws with the hem of his wolf pelt, like he was cleaning ink from his fingers. His amber gold eyes swept the hall, not with rage, not with triumph, just a flat, burning patience that made the air in the room feel immediately thinner. He was nothing like the man they had left bleeding in the Wastelands. He looked at his brothers. He almost smiled. "You started without me." 11 months ago, the keep smelled different. It smelled like tallow candles and wet stone and the particular sourness of a place that believed its own myths about itself. Nova had catalogued every detail of Ashveil Keep in her first 72 hours as its prisoner, the way an animal catalogues the dimensions of a new trap. She knew which corridor guards rotated at what hour. She knew the eastern tower had one loose bar on its third window. She knew the great hall's acoustics were terrible on the western side, which meant conversations held near the far wall carried further than the speakers intended. What she hadn't known, what no one had thought to warn her about, was the youngest Triplet. He didn't announce himself. That was the first thing. Every guard who'd come before him had opened her cell door like they were doing her a favor. Loud, deliberate, making sure she understood the power dynamic before they'd even crossed the threshold. Atlas opened the door like he was trying not to wake someone. Nova was sitting with her back against the far wall, knees drawn up, watching him the way she watched everything in this place. He was large. She registered that immediately. Broader through the shoulders than either of his brothers, though something about the way he held himself made him seem smaller than he was, like a man who'd spent years trying to take up less space in rooms that already resented his presence. He set the tray on the floor. Bread, dried meat, a cup of water that was actually clean. The previous guards had thought murky water was funny. He straightened up and looked at her. She looked back. "You're the runt," she said. It was the cruelest thing she could have said, and she knew it. She'd heard the guards talking, heard the way the whole keep whispered about him. The dormant wolf, the dead blood prince, the embarrassment of the bloodline. She'd said it to watch him flinch. He didn't flinch. "I'm Atlas," he said. "You need anything else, knock twice. Someone will come." He turned to leave. No performance, no wounded pride rearing up to punish her for the jab. He simply accepted the description and moved on, and that was what made her say the next thing. "The water is clean." He paused at the door, didn't turn around. "It should be," he said, and left. She thought about that for 3 days. It took him 4 visits before they spoke again in anything longer than a handful of words. He always came at the same hour, always with the same quiet efficiency, never with the casual menace the other guards deployed like a recreational sport. He didn't threaten her. He didn't leer. He didn't remind her what she was to this pack, a bargaining chip from a defeated rival. A Luna without a pack at her back, kept alive because killing her outright would have complicated the politics. On the 4th visit, she asked him why. He set the tray down, considered the question with the same unhurried patience she would come to understand was simply how his mind worked, not slow, just deliberate, like a man who'd learned a long time ago that speaking before he was ready cost him more than silence ever did. "Why what?" he asked. "Why are you the one doing this?" She gestured at the tray. "Guarding a captive, bringing her meals. Your brothers have servants for this." "My brothers assigned me." "I know. I'm asking why you do it the way you do." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because it costs me nothing to do it right." Nova looked at him for a long time after he left that evening. She thought about the way Caius had addressed her at the initial hearing, not with hatred, but with a flat, administrative contempt. The way a person might regard a broken piece of furniture they hadn't yet found a use for. She thought about Julian's laugh, which managed to be both charming and deeply threatening, depending entirely on whether it was directed at you. She thought about how Atlas had stood in the back of that same room during her sentencing, arms crossed, jaw set, and had said nothing. She'd assumed at the time that the silence was compliance. She was beginning to revise that assumption. By the 3rd week, she'd stopped sitting against the far wall when she heard his footsteps. By the 5th week, he'd started sitting in the doorway instead of standing in it, not crossing into her space, but no longer performatively outside of it either. They talked, carefully at first, then less carefully. He told her nothing about the pack's internal politics, and she respected that boundary without being asked to. She had her own understanding of what information cost a person who couldn't afford to spend it. Instead, he told her about the Wastelands, the territory past the eastern border that no sane pack claimed, all frozen scrubland and feral rogues, and the kind of silence that pressed against the ears like water pressure. He described it the way someone describes a place they've been to many times. Alone. "They send you out there?" she asked. "Patrol," he said. The word was technically accurate and communicated almost nothing, which she was beginning to understand was one of his methods. "They send you because the assignment isn't worth sending someone they'd miss," she said. He met her eyes. Didn't confirm it, didn't deny it. Just held her gaze with those amber eyes that were unusual even by the standards of wolf-blooded royalty. Too gold, too bright, occasionally doing something in low light that the rational part of her brain kept filing under tricks of the torchlight. "Tell me about your pack," he said. Redirecting. Another method. So she told him. She told him about the Varath pack and the mountain territory they'd held for 6 generations before Caius and Julian had decided they wanted the southern trade routes that ran through Vareth land. She told him about her Alpha, her pack members by name, what had happened to them in the siege, not with tears, because she'd burned through tears in the 1st week and come out the other side into something harder and more useful. She told him with the specific, "I controlled calm of someone taking inventory of damages after a fire. Here is what I had. Here is what was taken. Here is what remains." What remained was her. Atlas listened to all of it without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. When she finished, he said, "I'm sorry." Not, "I'm sorry for your loss," or "I'm sorry but this is war," or the worst one. "I'm sorry there was nothing I could do." Just the two words, direct and unqualified, and she understood he meant them in the fullest possible way. He was sorry. About what his brothers had done, about what the pack she'd been born to had suffered, about what she was sitting in right now. She didn't say it was fine because it wasn't. She said, "I know." The thing about falling in love in a place like that was that neither of them named it at first. It existed in the space between. In the way she'd started listening for his specific footstep in the corridor, and how the tension she carried in her chest like a clenched fist would ease by a degree when she heard it. In the way he'd begun finding reasons to extend the visits by 10 minutes, then 20, bringing her books from the Keep's modest library with no explanation, just leaving them on the tray like they'd always been part of the arrangement. In the specific way he looked at her, not with the hungry calculation of his brothers, but with something that was almost painful in its honesty, like she was the only thing in the Keep that made full sense to him. She reached for his hand one evening when he was leaving. She didn't plan it. It happened the way true things happen, without ceremony, without a prepared speech. Just her fingers closing around his wrist because he was walking away, and something in her body objected to that on a fundamental level. He stopped. She let go. "I didn't mean," she started. "Yes, you did," he said. Not unkind, not triumphant, just accurate. The first time Caius came to her cell personally, Atlas was there. That was, she understood later, what crystallized it for Caius. Not that his dormant brother had some affection for a captive, but the specific look on the captive's face when the door opened. The way Nova had shifted, almost imperceptibly, closer to Atlas's side of the doorway. The way she'd looked at Caius with her full contempt on display, unguarded, and then looked back at Atlas with something else entirely that she hadn't bothered to conceal. Caius stood in the entrance of the cell for a long moment. His eyes moved between them with the methodical attention of a man doing an accounting. "Brother," he said finally, his voice pleasant. "Give us a moment." Atlas didn't move immediately. That was the second thing Caius registered. She could see it in the slight tightening around his eyes. The half-second of hesitation from the brother who was supposed to be nothing, the one whose wolf slept so deep it might as well not exist. "Of course," Atlas said. He left, but he looked at her first, just for a moment. And in that moment she read everything. He'd be outside the door. He wasn't leaving the corridor. She was not alone in this, packed into a single 3-second look with the economy of two people who'd spent months learning to say entire sentences without opening their mouths. Caius talked to her for 7 minutes. He was charming about it, which was its own kind of threat. He spoke about the pack's future, her potential role in it, the various ways her situation could become more comfortable should she choose to direct her attention toward more appropriate and productive relationships. He never once said Atlas's name. He didn't need to. She smiled at him for the entire 7 minutes, which she knew, and he knew, and they both understood was a refusal delivered in the politest possible packaging. When he left, she heard him speak 2 quiet words to Atlas in the corridor. She couldn't make out the words, but she heard the tone. 3 weeks later, Julian started coming to the corridor too, sometimes just to stand near the door while Atlas was inside. Sometimes to clap a hand on Atlas's shoulder with the exaggerated warmth of a man performing brotherly love for an audience of 1. Sometimes just to look through the door's iron grate at Nova with that particular smile that said he understood exactly the shape of the thing he was planning to break. Atlas said nothing about any of it. He didn't bring it up. He didn't explain what was happening or try to minimize it. He simply started teaching her how to better conceal the signs that they were teaching her anything at all. How to move in the cell so it looked like restlessness rather than exercise. How to read the guard rotation by sound rather than by sight. how to make her face do the precise expression of a woman who has given up and accepted her circumstances. She wore it like a mask. Underneath it, every day she survived was a choice, and every choice was his. "They're going to move against you," she told him one evening, her voice low, the words landing between them with the weight of something they'd both already known. Atlas looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. "I know," he said. She grabbed his wrist again. This time she didn't let go. "Then don't go anywhere they tell you to go alone," she said. "Promise me." He looked at her with those impossible amber eyes, and for a moment the thing behind them that sometimes flickered in low torchlight seemed less like a trick and more like a warning, something buried very deep, pressing against the surface. "I'll be careful," he said. Which was not, she realized too late, a promise. He kept his promise the way careful men keep promises, partially and with the best intentions. For 3 weeks after Caius's visit, Atlas changed nothing outwardly. Same hour, same tray, same quiet efficiency. But Nova noticed the things that weren't the same. The visits ran slightly shorter. He sat in the doorway rather than across the threshold. When he looked at her now, there was something behind it that hadn't been there before. Not distance, but the deliberate effort of a man actively constructing distance, brick by careful brick, because he'd decided that was the kindest thing he could do for her. She let it go on for 4 days before she said anything. "You're doing it wrong," she told him. He looked up from where he'd set the tray. "Doing what wrong?" "Whatever you think you're protecting me from by pulling back." She held his gaze. "It's not working. And it's annoying." Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, not quite pain. The particular expression of a man who has been seen more clearly than he intended. "Nova, don't." She said it quietly, no heat in it. "Don't give me the speech about what I am in this keep and what you are and what this can't be. I've already had it in my own head. I gave it to myself every night for the first month." She paused. It didn't take then either. Atlas was quiet for a long moment. He had a way of going still when he was thinking that reminded her of deep water. No surface movement at all, everything happening somewhere below. "My brothers know," he said finally. "I know they know. That makes it dangerous. For you specifically. Atlas." She said his name the way you say a word you've been turning over in your mouth for a long time and have finally decided belongs there. "I was dangerous the moment they brought me through that gate. My danger didn't start with you." He looked at her. Really looked the way he sometimes did when he'd stopped trying to manage what his face was doing. And there it was, the thing she'd first noticed weeks ago in the quality of his attention. The way she'd never once felt observed by him the way she felt observed by every other person in this keep. With Caius, she was a problem to be managed. With Julian, she was a game to be won. With Atlas, she was simply herself. Entirely, without reduction. It was the most disorienting thing anyone had ever done to her. "Come inside," she said. "Sit down. Stop building walls in a doorway." A beat. Then he stepped inside and sat against the wall beside her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, far enough to maintain the pretense of a boundary neither of them believed in anymore. The fire in the corridor threw orange light through the grate. It softened everything. The harsh stone, the iron fixtures, the careful distance he was still trying to hold on to. "Tell me something true," she said. A thing they'd started doing somewhere around the 4th week, an exchange they'd never named. He thought about it. "I haven't slept a full night in 2 years." She absorbed that. "Because of the Wastelands patrols? Because of—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Partially. And the rest?" He turned his head and looked at her directly. So in the low light, his eyes were doing the thing again, that deep amber burn that lived right at the edge of something she couldn't name. The rest is this keep, he said. What happens in it? What I can't stop. She understood what he meant. She'd seen it in the small moments. The way his jaw set when one of his brothers spoke in the great hall, and he had to stand there in his place at the back, the low-born position, the one assigned to the dormant wolf, because ceremony demanded a hierarchy, and hierarchy demanded someone at the bottom. She'd watched him through the grate during one of the formal dinners she could half see from her cell's position, watched Caius put a hand on his shoulder and say something that made three nobles laugh and made Atlas go absolutely perfectly still. "Tell me something true," he said. His turn. She didn't hesitate. "I stopped trying to find the loose bar on the east tower window 5 weeks ago." He went very still. "Nova, I'm not explaining it. You already know why." She looked at her hands. "That's the true thing." The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture and weight, and the specific quality of two people standing at the edge of something they've been pretending wasn't there, and finally, mutually, looking down. Atlas reached over and covered her hand with his. Not a gesture, not a move, just his hand over hers, warm and certain, and the particular silence of a man who has run out of reasons to pretend he doesn't mean it. She turned her hand over and held on. They stayed like that while the fire in the corridor burned lower. He told her about growing up in the keep, not with self-pity, which she'd noticed he was constitutionally incapable of, but with the flat specificity of someone describing weather. The dormancy diagnosis at age 9, the way the pack's deference had simply redistributed overnight, the wolves who'd been warm becoming carefully neutral, the ones who'd been neutral becoming cruel in the small, deniable ways that institutions permit. His brothers had not invented their contempt for him. They had simply been the loudest expression of a thing the entire keep had already decided. "And you stayed," she said. "It's my home." "It stopped treating you like it was." "Homes don't always." He said it without bitterness. "Doesn't change what they are." She looked at his profile in the low light. The strong line of his jaw, the shadows under his eyes that spoke to 2 years of broken sleep, or the scar along his left forearm she'd noticed on his 3rd visit and never asked about because some questions wait for their moment. "The scar," she said. His thumb moved across her knuckles, a brief automatic press. "Border skirmish. 2 years ago. I was the only one out there. They sent you alone." Not a question. He answered it anyway. "They said it was a small patrol." "Was it?" The pause told her everything the answer didn't. "No." She thought about that. About a man who had survived a border skirmish alone, had come back to a keep that viewed his survival as mildly inconvenient, and had continued without apparent resentment to do his job with more basic decency than anyone who outranked him. She thought about what that kind of endurance costs a person, and where they put the bill when it comes due. "What do you want?" she asked. "Not from this situation, not from your brothers, just what do you actually want?" He took a long time with it, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I want to be standing somewhere and not feel like I'm in the way." The simplicity of it hit her somewhere behind the sternum. She'd expected something about power or recognition, or the specific revenge fantasies that sustained people who'd been diminished for long enough. She hadn't expected that. The plain, exhausted want of a man who had spent so long being treated as an obstacle in his own home that the baseline dream had become merely existing without apology. She turned to face him fully. "Look at me," she said. He did. "You are not in my way," she said, each word precise and separate. "You are the only reason I still know what it feels like to be treated like a person. Do you understand what that means in a place like this?" His jaw tightened. Not against what she was saying, against the fact that it was reaching him. She could see it. The specific resistance of someone who hasn't been offered something real in so long that receiving it feels structurally incorrect. Nova. Atlas. Same quiet, same certainty. I'm not asking you to believe you're extraordinary. I'm asking you to believe that I'm telling the truth. The amber in his eyes burned steadier than she'd ever seen it. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Slowly, with a kind of care that understood it was crossing a line they'd both been standing behind for weeks, and was crossing it anyway, deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost. I believe you, he said. What they built in the weeks that followed lived in the margins of the keep's awareness, a thing of corridor silences and borrowed hours and the particular intimacy of two people who had no privacy learning to carve out a private world in the space between sentences. He brought her paper when he could get it without attracting notice. She wrote him a detailed, strategic analysis of the keep's southern perimeter, half serious, half a joke, entirely an act of trust, because the information in that document could have been used against her, and they both knew it, and she handed it to him anyway. He read it, looked up at her, and said, "The Eastern approach is worse than you think," and proceeded to tell her exactly why, with the familiarity of someone who had walked it alone in the dark more times than he could count. She fell a little further. She fell in the moment he stood between her and a guard who'd come for the tray with more aggression than the errand required. Said nothing, just stepped into the space between them with a calm that was somehow more threatening than any raised voice. And the guard had backed down, and Nova had watched it happen and thought, there it is. Whatever sleeps in him, it is not nothing. She fell in the moment she woke from a nightmare about the siege, the real one, the one she didn't talk about, the one with the sounds, and found him already in the corridor outside her door, sitting against the wall with his back to the stone. Because he'd apparently been awake too, and when their eyes met through the grate, he didn't ask what was wrong, just held her gaze until the shaking in her hands stopped. She never asked what he'd been doing in the corridor at that hour. He never explained. Some things between them existed in a register beyond explanation. It was Julian who first noticed the way Atlas moved when someone mentioned her name in conversation. A micro thing, a half-second of attention, a slight orientation of the body, the instinct of a man whose senses are attuned to a specific frequency, even when he's pretending otherwise. Julian had the observational gifts of someone who had always understood that people were puzzles, and that puzzles existed to be taken apart. He mentioned it to Caius over wine one evening. Caius was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his cup. "How certain are you?" he asked. "Certain enough," Julian said, "that I think we've been misreading what the dormant wolf actually is." Another silence. "And the woman?" Julian smiled, the kind of smile that arrived well ahead of its actual meaning. "Leverage," he said simply. "The purest kind, the kind a man will do anything to protect." Caius picked his cup back up, turned it in his hands. Outside the window, the wastelands stretched dark and frozen to the eastern horizon, and somewhere out there the border patrols ran their routes, and one of those routes was assigned exclusively to the brother they had spent their lives discounting. "Then we use it," Caius said. In her cell, 3 corridors away, Nova was holding a book Atlas had left her and not reading a single word of it. She was listening to the keep around her the way she'd trained herself to listen. Not for what was being said, but for the shape of what wasn't, the quality of the silences. The way the guard rotation had shifted by 7 minutes in the last 2 days without explanation. The way Julian had walked past her corridor that afternoon and hadn't looked in. That last part was the one that sat wrong. Julian always looked in. She closed the book. She pressed her back against the wall and looked at the door and thought about a man who had promised to be careful and not promised to be safe. and she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has survived enough to develop a sense for incoming weather, that something had already been set in motion. The question was only when. The order came on a Thursday. Atlas knew it was a Thursday because Nova had asked him the day before what day it was. And he'd told her Wednesday, and she'd said she was losing track of time, and he'd said he'd bring her a calendar, and she'd laughed, a real one, the kind that started in her chest and arrived at her face without asking permission. And he'd thought about that laugh for the entire walk back to his quarters. He was still thinking about it when Caius's messenger knocked on his door at dawn. Border anomaly. Eastern perimeter. Possible rogue incursion. Report at the eastern gate. Full patrol gear before first light. Atlas read it twice. Not because the words were complicated, because he was giving himself 2 full readings to decide what he felt about them and what he intended to do about what he felt. He felt wrong about it. The particular wrongness of a thing that fits too neatly. A mission shaped exactly like the kind of mission you'd invent if you needed to move someone somewhere without witnesses. He went anyway. He told himself it was because refusing a direct order would cost him more than it would cost them, and right now the only currency that mattered was staying inside this keep. He told himself that. It was not entirely untrue, but the fuller truth, the one he didn't examine too closely as he buckled his armor in the pre-dawn dark, was that he was not yet ready to believe his brothers would go this far. There was a version of them, a version he'd constructed over years, held together with a child's stubborn optimism that was arrogant and cruel and political, but not this, not whatever this was shaping up to be. He was about to pay for that version. There were 3 men assigned to the patrol. His men, or the closest thing he had to his own. Defiant, who'd been running eastern routes with him for 2 years and had the particular loyalty of someone who'd seen you at your worst in bad weather and stayed anyway. Corvin, young enough to still believe that doing the right thing was a reliable strategy. Wren, who spoke rarely and observed everything and whose instincts Atlas trusted more than most people's explicit reports. They assembled at the gate without ceremony. Atlas looked at their faces in the gray pre-dawn light and knew, with the part of him that processed information below the level of conscious thought, that he should send them back. He didn't. He told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself that if he was wrong, sending them back would look like insubordination. He told himself a lot of things in the 40 seconds he stood at that gate. Then Defiant said, "Ready when you are," and they went. The Wastelands received them the way they always did, indifferently, completely, the cold pressing in from every direction with the democratic thoroughness of a force that didn't distinguish between the deserving and the otherwise. Atlas knew this territory. He'd walked it alone and in darkness and in conditions that had killed better-equipped men. The frozen scrubland, the skeletal tree lines, the way sound carried differently out here, flatter, like the landscape itself had given up on acoustics. He was tracking a trail that didn't look quite right when Wren moved up beside him and said, very quietly, "There's no rogue sign out here." "I know," Atlas said. A pause. "Then what are we tracking?" Atlas stopped walking. They came from the tree line on 3 sides, 12 of them, no, 15. He counted fast and his body was already moving before his mind had finished the count, because his body understood what his mind was still refusing to accept. Royal Guard armor. The gold trim of the commander's unit. Elite. The best his brothers had. Defiant got his sword up first. It didn't matter. What followed lasted 4 minutes. Atlas would know this later, from the position of the light. In the moment it had no duration, just a sequence of images with the logic burned out of them. Defiant going down under 3 men at once, fighting with the desperate ferocity of someone who understood exactly what this was. Corvin's voice cut short. Ren managing to take 2 of them with him before the silver-edged blades found the gaps in his guard. Silver. They'd brought silver blades. That detail landed in Atlas's chest like a stone dropped into still water, the rings of it spreading outward, cold and clarifying. This was not a message. This was not a warning. Silver blades meant they intended to make sure the wound didn't close. He fought. He fought the way a man fights when he has nothing left to lose on the field, except his life, which he wasn't yet sure he wanted to lose, which meant some part of him was still operating on the premise that there was something to go back to. He took 2 of them down, then a third. He was reaching for a 4th when the blade caught him across the chest, a deep diagonal cut from left shoulder to right hip. And the silver in it was immediate and total, a burning that wasn't like ordinary pain, that went through the skin and into something underneath, something older than muscle. He went to his knees in the frozen mud. The world did something strange at the edges. Not dark, just imprecise, like a painting left in rain. Caius's men stepped back, catching their breath. 3 of them down, another 2 nursing wounds that would need attention. Atlas noted this with the remote clarity of a man whose body has moved into shock's anteroom, where everything is still visible but nothing quite connects to consequence. Then the line parted, and the commander himself walked through. Aldrich, the unbeatable one, gold-trimmed, unhurried, with the specific confidence of a man who has been told this would be easy and has found the assessment accurate. He crouched down in front of Atlas, not close enough to be in range. Professional caution, even now. He studied Atlas's face with the detached curiosity of a naturalist examining a specimen. "The prince wanted me to tell you something," Aldrich said. Atlas said nothing. Breathing required the full available budget. "He said to tell you that the woman—" A brief pause, the theatrical kind. "Nova. He said to tell you that she'll be claimed before you're cold." He tilted his head. "He wanted you to hear it from someone. He thought it would be unkind to let you go without knowing." Something happened in Atlas's chest that was not the silver wound. Something that had no medical name, that operated on a frequency below pain. Say, he thought about the corridor outside her cell, and the way she'd said his name the first time, like she'd been testing the weight of it. He thought about the loose bar on the east tower window she'd stopped trying to work free. He thought about the calendar he'd told her he'd bring back. He thought about her face. "Get up," Aldrich said, almost gentle. A man performing mercy before the real business. "It'll go faster if you—" Atlas put his hand in the mud and pushed. He didn't get up. His body had an honest relationship with physics, and the silver was making the math unfavorable. But he pushed far enough that Aldrich stood and stepped back, which told Atlas the man wasn't as confident as he'd presented. Good. That was useful data. He filed it somewhere for later and then catalogued the immediate reality. 3 of his men dead in the mud around him, 15 guards, blood leaving him faster than it should through a wound that silver wouldn't let close, temperature dropping as the pre-dawn gray shifted toward the pale, flat light of a wasteland morning. He made it to one knee. 2 of the guards moved in. What they did to him after that he endured the way he'd endured the childhood of the dormant wolf, and the years of demeaning patrols and every quiet cruelty the keep had found interesting. Without sound, without giving them the satisfaction of his reaction, storing the information in the part of him that kept accounts. The silver blades opened new lines across his back, his arms. Each one burned with the specific wrongness of a thing designed to undo wolves from the inside, attacking the biology first and the man second. Aldrich watched. He gave no orders to stop and no orders to continue. He watched with the patience of a professional waiting for a professional outcome. It was Caius, Atlas understood. All the way out here, it was Caius. His fastidious planning, his need for this to look like a wasteland casualty if the body was ever found, his understanding that a missing prince was a political problem, but a prince lost to the borderlands was a tragedy that closed its own case. Julian would have made it faster. Julian found suffering tedious. This careful, extended, silver-laced work was Caius entirely. Atlas stopped counting what was happening to his body and started counting heartbeats. Still there. Not still there. Slower, but there. The ground was very cold against his cheek. He hadn't decided to lie down. His legs had decided for him. Aldrich crouched again, checked for something. Pulse, probably, or the specific stillness that meant the work was finished. Atlas held himself as still as the cold allowed, which wasn't very still, because the body makes its own arguments at the end, and his was making several. But still enough that Aldrich stood after a moment and said to his men, "Leave them." Boots on frozen ground, moving away. The count of them, 15 sets, then 14, then the sound of them swallowed by distance and wind, then nothing. Nothing but the flat wasteland silence and the sound of his own breathing, which was happening in a register he didn't recognize. Something too shallow and too fast. The body doing emergency arithmetic with what remained. Devon was 3 feet away. Atlas could see him without moving his head. He didn't look at him for long. He looked at the sky instead. Gray going white at the edges. The cold was past the point of feeling like cold. It had become a kind of pressure, generalized, surrounding. The silver in his wounds burned against it, the two sensations fighting for the same territory. He thought about Nova, not with the desperate, grasping quality of a man trying to hold on to something. Calmer than that. She arrived in his mind the way she always did. Fully formed, immediate, without announcement. The look on her face when he'd stepped into the guard's path. The warmth of her hand turned over in his. The precise tone of voice she used when she was about to say something she'd already decided she was going to say regardless of the consequences, that quarter second of gathering she did before speaking her truth into a room that hadn't asked for it. She would survive this. She would survive his brothers the way she survived everything, through a stubborn refusal to give them what they were actually after, which was not her submission but her breaking. And she would not break. He knew this with more certainty than he knew most things. He took a breath that didn't have enough air in it. Then another. The silver was doing something systematic now, working through him methodically, attacking whatever his dormant bloodline had left intact. Finding the deep biological architecture of what he was and pressing against it like a key turning in a lock. He could feel it, not as pain specifically, but as pressure, a pressure that was building rather than releasing. That was wrong. Silver should weaken, not build. Silver should close things down. Something below the silver was pushing back. Atlas pressed his hand into the frozen mud. The pressure built past the point where his nervous system had language for it. He felt his spine do something it had not done before. A deep tectonic shift, not painful in the ordinary sense because ordinary pain lived in a completely different neighborhood from whatever this was. His fingers in the mud elongated. He watched this happen with the dissociated calm of extreme shock and registered it as information without yet processing what the information meant. His vision went gold, not the gray going black of blood loss. Gold, amber burning, deep and total, like standing inside a struck bell while it was still ringing. He opened his mouth and what came out was not a sound he had made before. The Wastelands absorbed it the way they absorbed everything, completely, without echo, without witness. The frozen scrubland and the skeletal trees and the flat white sky received it and gave nothing back. 3 feet away in the mud, Devon's hand was still. Atlas looked at it. at his man's still hand in the frozen mud, and at Corvin's upturned face with its expression of startled incompletion, and at Wren lying with the particular flatness of a thing that has finished. The grief hit him like the silver had, not from outside, but from inside, systemic, structural, moving through him and changing the composition of what it moved through. And underneath the grief, below it, older and larger, and finally, awake, the rage. The scavengers came at dusk. 3 of them. Wasteland rogues, the kind that stopped being pack wolves so long ago that the pack instinct had dissolved entirely, leaving behind something that operated purely on appetite. They moved in the specific way of things that have learned to read a battlefield's aftermath. Low, fast, testing the air, following the copper smell of opened bodies. They found the site easily. 4 bodies, extensive blood pooling already beginning to freeze at the edges. The rogues spread out without communicating. Old habit, the ghost of coordinated behavior. The largest one reached Atlas first. It got one hand on his shoulder before Atlas's arm came up and removed the problem. The other 2 scattered. Survival instinct, clean and immediate. They covered 20 feet before they registered that what was behind them was faster. Atlas didn't run the way he'd run before. Before had been a man moving quickly. This was something with a different relationship to ground, each stride covering distance that the physics of a human frame didn't quite account for, the wastelands blurring at the edges of a gold-lit field of vision that saw everything in crystalline, horrible detail. The second rogue made it 30 feet. The third made it less. Atlas stood in the gray dusk of the wasteland and looked at his hands. They were his hands, larger than they'd been this morning, the knuckles more pronounced, the tendons visible under skin that had a new quality to it. Denser somehow, like the material had been compacted. The claws had partially retracted, but not entirely. He watched them and waited to feel something about what they meant. What he felt was hungry and cold and oriented with a compass point certainty that had no explanation, toward the northwest, toward the keep. He turned away from it deliberately. Not yet. First, he needed to understand what he was. He spent the first week learning the inventory of his own body, the way you learn a new weapon. Methodically, without sentiment, testing the range and the limits. The transformation wasn't complete. It came and went in the early days. The hybrid state arriving and receding with a logic he hadn't yet mapped, triggered sometimes by threat, sometimes by nothing he could identify, sometimes by the specific quality of rage that came over him at 3 a.m. when he lay in the ruins of a wasteland shelter and thought about what Aldrich had said. "She'll be claimed before you're cold." He used those words. He kept them close and used them the way a whetstone gets used, deliberately, consistently, to maintain an edge. The silver wounds closed in 4 days. That was the first data point. Silver that should have kept him bleeding for weeks, that was specifically designed to prevent wolf biology from repairing itself, closed in 4 days and left behind scars that ran diagonal across his chest, like a map of what his brothers had spent on trying to end him. He pressed his fingers against them in the dark and felt the raised tissue and thought, good. He wanted the record. He intended to display it. By the second week, he could hold the hybrid state deliberately. By the third, he understood the size differential. He was larger in the hybrid form, significantly, in a way that went beyond muscle mass into something structural. The frame itself altered, the shoulders wider, the height increased by enough to change how doorways worked. He tested himself against an abandoned border outpost, its stone walls, its reinforced gate. Got useful information. He did not go back to the keep. Not yet, not close to yet. The rogues found him, or he found them. It was mutual, and it was inevitable, because the Wastelands were not large enough for two apex presences to avoid each other indefinitely. The first pack he encountered had 17 members, and a dominant who'd been running this territory for 6 years and had the record of it written in other wolves' scars across his hide. The dominant saw Atlas across a frozen gulch at midday, and made the territorial display. The full posture, chest out, the direct stare that in wolf hierarchy was either a greeting between equals or a declaration. Atlas looked back at him. The dominant held it for 11 seconds. Atlas counted. Then the dominant dropped his eyes. Not submission. Wolves like this didn't offer submission easily, but recognition. The specific acknowledgement of a creature that has assessed the situation accurately and made a rational decision. Atlas crossed the gulch. "I'm not here for your territory," he said. His voice had changed, not unrecognizably, but in register, something lower and more resonant beneath the ordinary frequencies. "I'm building something. You can be part of it, or you can stay out of my way. Both options are available right now." He paused. "One of them won't be available later." The dominant studied him for a long moment, took in the size, the eyes, the scars, the particular quality of stillness that very dangerous things develop when they've stopped needing to perform danger. "What are you building?" the dominant asked. "An army," Atlas said, "and a reason." The second pack took longer. 3 days of parallel movement through adjacent territory, each side aware of the other, neither committing. The dominant here was smarter than the first, warier, more political, the kind of leader who'd survived by never being the first one through a door. She sent a scout. Atlas talked to the scout for 20 minutes and sent her back with enough information to make the calculation obvious. The dominant came herself the next morning. Her name was Sura. She'd been running rogues for 9 years, had built her pack from 11 to 43, and had a mind that worked in the specific way of people who've had to be right more often than they could afford to be wrong. She looked at Atlas the way Ren used to look at things. Total assessment, no performance. "You're royal blood," she said, not a question. "I was," Atlas said. "Currently, I'm something else. What do you want?" The pack that sits on the Ashveil throne has been running border raids on wasteland territories for 6 years. You know this because 3 of those raids hit your eastern boundary. He watched her jaw set. He'd done his research. "I'm going to remove the leadership. I need bodies who can move quietly, hit hard, and follow a single command at the critical moment without requiring explanation. And after, the raids stop." Sura was quiet for a moment. "That's a very small offer." "The raids stop permanently," Atlas said, "because the wolves who ordered them will be permanently unavailable to order anything else. And the wolf who takes the throne will have an interest in keeping the wasteland border quiet." He met her eyes. "Because he spent a year in it." She looked at him for a long moment. "How long?" "However long it takes to do it correctly." She gave him 32 fighters, told him she'd double it when she believed him. He said that was fair. He spent the next 3 months making sure she believed him. He didn't recruit through fear alone. Through fear made useful soldiers and terrible allies. What he built instead was something more durable, a reputation, constructed fight by fight, decision by decision, through the specific currency of being right consistently in situations where being wrong ended you. He made calls in the field that saved lives. He took the front position in engagements and didn't ask anyone to go somewhere he hadn't already been. When there was food, he ate last. These were not complicated leadership principles. They were old and they worked, and the rogues who'd been running the Wastelands long enough to be deeply cynical about authority recognized them immediately because they'd almost never encountered them. The army grew. Not quickly. Atlas had no interest in quickly. Quick armies were visible. He wanted something that arrived as a surprise. Oh, which meant building it slowly and carefully in the geography of a place that the Ashveil Pack had already decided wasn't worth monitoring carefully. Caius had spent years treating the Wastelands as a dumping ground, a place to send things he wanted to lose. He was about to discover the problem with that approach. By month 4, Atlas had 207 fighters. By month 7, 412. By month 10, he stopped counting and started planning logistics, which told him more than the count did about whether a force was actually functional. He learned things in those months that the Keep had never taught him. He learned that authority earned through demonstrated competence created a different quality of loyalty than authority inherited through blood, deeper, more conditional, more honest. He learned that the rogues who'd survived the Wastelands longest had a particular kind of intelligence that the pampered wolves of Ashveil had systematically undervalued, which was a mistake he intended to correct when he had the ability to correct anything. He learned what he was, gradually, in pieces. The hybrid bloodline was not a new thing. It was an old thing. Older than the Ashveil Pack, older than the pure-blood ideology his brothers had built their entire identity on. He found a rogue elder in the Wasteland's northern reach, a woman who'd outlived 4 pack collapses and had the historical memory that came with that kind of survival. She told him what she knew about the ancient Lycan hybrid lines, which wasn't everything, but was enough. Or she told him that the dormancy was a known feature of the bloodline, that the power sealed itself in the absence of sufficient trauma and unsealed in its presence, which was a brutal biological logic, but logical nonetheless. And once it's awake, he asked. It doesn't go back, she said simply. You understand that? Yes, he said. He'd understood it since the first night, lying in the mud, watching his hands change shape by torchlight. By month 11, he knew the coronation date. It came through reliable channels, a rogue who'd been running supply routes into the outer keep territories, who had contacts inside the servant population, who understood that information was its own form of currency in a place where hard currency required allegiance he no longer felt like offering. The coronation of Caius and Julian as co-kings of the Ashveil Pack. A formal ceremony, the great hall at capacity, the full population of the pack assembled to witness the transfer of power made permanent. Atlas received this information and sat with it for one night. He thought about the timing, the optics, the specific message that a particular kind of entrance would send, not just to his brothers, but to every wolf in that hall who'd spent years watching the hierarchy operate the way it operated, who'd decided that the way things were was the way things had to be, who needed to see something that rearranged that assumption at a foundational level. He thought about Nova, where she'd be positioned, what state she'd be in, what 11 months of Caius and Julian's specific brand of cruelty might have done to someone who refused to break. He thought about her and felt the familiar compound thing, the grief of her absence, the rage at what had caused it, and underneath both, steady and structural as a foundation beam, the certainty that she had not broken. He knew this the way he knew his own heartbeat. She had not given them what they wanted. She was waiting. He owed her a calendar. He was going to deliver something better. He called Sura. He called the other dominant fighters. He laid out the plan with the same methodical precision he'd applied to everything in the Wastelands. Clear objectives, contingency positions, signal protocols, the specific timing that would maximize impact and minimize the window for organized defense response. The perimeter first, he said, silent. I need the outer defenses down before anyone inside that hall has reason to look toward the gates. He looked around at the assembled faces, scarred, weathered, completely attentive. I need it quiet until I walk through that door. And after you walk through, Sura asked, Atlas picked up his wolf pelt from the ground beside him, a massive, ragged thing taken from the largest predator the Wastelands had produced in the last decade, worn not for warmth, but for the specific message that a man who'd spent a year out here and come back wearing its apex predator as a cloak was a man who'd had a productive year. After I walk through, he said, it stops being quiet. He looked east. Through the dark in the distance and the frozen scrubland, somewhere at the end of that bearing, a hall was being prepared for a coronation. Flowers, probably. Gold trim. The white ceremonial cloaks his brothers had been planning to wear since childhood, finally getting their moment. He thought about Aldrich, specifically. The crouch, the professional patience, the information delivered as a kindness because Caius had wanted him to know. He thought about Commander Aldrich and what he intended to deliver to Caius in return. He put on the wolf pelt. Move out, he said. The hall had gone the specific quiet of a place where everyone has simultaneously decided that breathing too loudly is a liability. Atlas stood over what remained of Commander Aldrich and did nothing dramatic with it. He didn't need to. The head had already done its work. It had rolled to Caius's boots with the finality of a delivered message, and every wolf in the great hall had read it in the same instant. Oh, the unbeatable commander! The gold-trimmed elite! The man Caius had sent into the Wastelands 14 months ago to solve a problem cleanly. Returned, in pieces. As a greeting, Atlas wiped his claws on the wolf pelt and looked at his brothers. Caius had not moved from his throne. This was either courage or the paralysis that arrives when a worldview suffers a structural failure, and Atlas, who had spent 11 months learning to read the difference between those two things in the field, knew which one he was looking at. Julian had risen slightly from his seat, one hand on the armrest, his weight distributed in the way of a man calculating exit options and finding the math unfavorable. No guards came. That was the thing Julian registered first. Atlas watched him register it, watched the precise moment his brother understood that the hall's perimeter had already been resolved before Atlas walked through the door. Julian's eyes moved to the main entrance, then the side corridor, then back to Atlas. The calculation completed. The result was not useful to him. Brother, Atlas said. The word landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. You look well, Julian said. His voice was almost steady. Almost. Considering, Atlas agreed. He walked forward. Not fast. There was no tactical requirement for fast anymore. Fast was for situations where the outcome was still in question, and this one had been decided the moment Sura's units finished the perimeter work 2 hours ago. For every exit from this hall was currently occupied by a wasteland wolf who had signed on specifically for the opportunity to stand in an Ashveil doorway and make it impassable. Atlas had been methodical about the staffing. The crowd parted as he moved through it. Not dramatically. They simply reorganized around him, the way water reorganizes around something dropped into it. The physics of it involuntary. He watched their faces as he passed. Nobles who'd attended every formal function of his childhood. Pack elders who'd sat in their chairs the day the dormancy diagnosis was delivered and had quietly updated their political calculations accordingly. Wolves who'd been warm to him once, then carefully neutral, then entirely elsewhere whenever he entered a room. They were all very present now. He stopped 10 feet from the dais. Close enough for conversation, far enough that every person in the hall could see everything that was about to happen without obstruction. He'd thought about the geometry of this moment in the Wastelands. The sight lines mattered. Where is she? He said. Not a question, a coordinate request. Caius finally spoke. His voice had the particular quality of a man deploying composure as a weapon, because it's the only one he has left. You've made an entrance, Atlas. I'll grant you that. But you're standing in the middle of a coronation, with a dead man's blood on your hands, and no legal standing in this pack. Whatever you think you've built out there. Where is she? The hall absorbed the silence. Nova's voice came from the left side of the dais. I'm here. He found her without difficulty because some part of him had known her position since he'd walked through the door, catalogued it in the first sweep, and had been managing the distance between that knowledge and his face for the last 3 minutes. She was kneeling on the stone to the left of the thrones, chained at the wrists, her captive's gown worn and simple against the opulence around her. 11 months of Caius's particular hospitality, written in the careful way she held herself. Upright, deliberate, the posture of someone who had decided a long time ago that they were not going to be found in any other position. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at him through a cell door grate in a dark corridor at 3 a.m, like he was a fixed point. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked back at Caius. Legal standing, Atlas said, returning to the thread as though he'd never left it. You want to talk about legal standing? He tilted his head. Tell the pack what you sent into the Wastelands 14 months ago. A border patrol. Tell them what you sent. Caius's jaw set. A border patrol. You were assigned 15 men, Atlas said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The hall's acoustics were excellent on the eastern side. He'd always known that. Silver blades. 3 of my men dead before I went down. Aldrich standing over me delivering a personal message from you. He paused. About her. The hall made a sound, not words, just the collective intake of a group of people recalibrating. Julian said, That's a significant accusation without... Aldrich is not available to dispute it, Atlas said. I made sure of that on the way in. Caius stood. It was a calculated move. Elevation, authority, the physical claim of the throne's power. He was still a large wolf, still carried himself with the built confidence of a lifetime of being told he was the rightful thing in every room he entered. He looked at Atlas with the expression of a man who has decided that the narrative can still be controlled. You've come back changed, Caius said. We can see that. And whatever happened to you out there, whatever you've become, there is still a structure to this pack, a hierarchy. You don't get to walk into this hall and take my throne. The word landed. Caius stopped. It was always mine, Atlas said. You knew that. That's why you needed me dead. He looked around the hall slowly, addressing the crowd with the same deliberate patience he'd used in the Wastelands. No performance, just information, delivered directly to people who were capable of processing it. The hybrid bloodline doesn't pass through the oldest. It passes through the truest. Every elder in this room over 60 years of age knows that. It's in the pack's founding records. My brothers removed the relevant pages 4 years ago, but removing pages doesn't remove what people remember. He watched 3 of the older pack elders in the front row look at each other. There it was. Caius took a step forward. You have no proof. I have 14 months of proof, Atlas said. I have scars from your silver blades across my chest. I have 400 wasteland wolves standing in every exit of this building who came here because your border raids have been bleeding their territories for 6 years, and I made them a promise. He met Caius's eyes. And I have every person in this hall who is currently doing the arithmetic on who is actually the more dangerous problem going forward. Julian moved. He came off the dais fast and at an angle, not toward Atlas directly, but toward the left side, toward Nova, and Atlas had already moved before Julian's second step landed because he'd mapped this contingency in the Wastelands too, had thought about exactly which play his brothers would make when the political argument failed, and Julian had always defaulted to leverage. Atlas intercepted him 4 feet from Nova. He didn't use his claws. He put one hand on Julian's chest and stopped him. Completely. The way a wall stops someone. Julian looked down at the hand on his chest, then up at Atlas. Whatever he'd been about to say left him. "Sit down, Julian," Atlas said quietly. "I'm not going to tell you twice." Julian sat. Not on the throne, on the dais steps, because his legs made the decision before his pride could weigh in. He sat and looked at his brother with the first honest expression Atlas had seen on his face in a decade. Pure, unmediated fear. Not of dying, necessarily. Julian had always been brave about his own survival in the abstract. Fear of this specific reversal. Fear of what it meant that the thing he'd written off at 9 years old was standing in front of him, taking up space, that the geometry of the room could no longer argue with. Atlas turned back to Caius. Caius was still standing, still deploying the composure. But it was technical now, the performance of a thing that had left the building. "The armor," Atlas said. Caius stared at him. "Take it off. You cannot seriously—" "Every person in this hall watched you put Nova on her knees in chains for 11 months, Atlas said. "Every person in this hall is going to watch you take off the armor you haven't earned and get on your knees in the same spot. That's not a negotiation, that's the accounting." The first elder stood. She was old, one of the oldest in the pack, had lived through 3 leadership transitions, and had the specific authority of someone whose opinion had been sought in every significant pack decision for 40 years. She stood from her seat in the front row and looked at Caius with an expression that contained an entire verdict. She sat back down, facing Atlas. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply a reorientation. But in the language of pack hierarchy, it was unambiguous, and the wolves around her read it in real time. The murmuring shifted, not louder but different in quality. The sound of a room reaching a conclusion. Caius looked at the elder, then at the crowd, then back at Atlas. He removed the armor, piece by piece in the hall where he'd held court for 4 years, where he'd sentenced Nova and positioned himself as the inevitable future of the Ashveil bloodline. The gold-trimmed chest plate, the pauldrons, each piece hitting the marble floor with the flat sound of something that has lost its meaning. Julian followed. Or he did it faster. Julian had always been pragmatic about sunk costs. They knelt in the spot where Nova's chains were bolted to the floor. Atlas looked at them for a moment. He thought about Aldrich crouching in the frozen mud and delivering Caius's message with professional courtesy. He thought about Davan's still hand, Corvin's upturned face. Wren, who spoke rarely and observed everything, and whose observations had run out in a frozen gulch on a Thursday morning. He thought about what justice actually weighed versus what revenge weighed, and found, standing here in this hall with this crowd watching, that he didn't experience them as different things. Caius of Ashveil, Julian of Ashveil, for the murder of 3 sworn pack members, for the attempted assassination of bloodkin through deception and silver, for the unlawful imprisonment and abuse of a Luna under pack protection. He looked at them both. The sentence is execution for treason, carried out by the ranking bloodline member present. Caius looked up. For just a moment, the composure cracked entirely, and Atlas saw what had always been underneath it. Not the arrogant king, not the cold strategist, just a man who had spent his entire life terrified of being insufficient and had made catastrophic decisions from that terror. "Atlas." "I know," Atlas said. It was the same 2 words he'd given Nova in a cell, the same weight, the same finality. It was over quickly. Atlas was not cruel about it. Cruelty was for people who needed the target to suffer in order to feel that something had been resolved. And he had resolved this question a long time ago in the Wastelands, in the dark, in the specific arithmetic of what his men's lives were worth. He crossed to Nova in 4 steps. She was already pulling at the chains, not in panic, just the focused, purposeful motion of someone who has been waiting 11 months for the moment when pulling would do something. He took the chains in both hands and broke them at the bolts. The silver burned his palms and he didn't stop. The links gave and she was standing, fully, her wrists freed, and she looked at her hands for a moment like she was reacquainting herself with what they were for. Then she looked at him. Up close, after 11 months, the details were different, and the same. The emerald eyes, unchanged, still doing the thing where they measured everything they looked at, still carrying the full, unmediated attention that had undone him from the first week. The marks of captivity on her wrists where the silver had pressed. The posture, still regal, still the unbroken line of a woman who had decided in the first week that she was not going to be found in any other position. "You're late," she said. "I had to build an army." 11 months. "It's a large army." She put her hand against his chest, against the scar that ran diagonal from shoulder to hip, visible above the line of his collar. She pressed her palm flat against it and felt it the way you feel something you've carried knowledge of for a long time and are finally locating in the physical world. He covered her hand with his. Same as before, same gesture, different hall. He reached into his belt with his other hand and produced a crown. Not the gold-trimmed ceremonial piece his brothers had been planning to wear today. That was on the floor with the armor. This was the Ashveil bloodline crown, the old one, iron and dark, the one that had been locked in the vault because Caius had found its aesthetic insufficiently impressive. Atlas had retrieved it on the way in. He'd thought about that too, in the Wastelands. He placed it on her head, not with ceremony, not with a speech. Just set it there, on a woman who had survived 11 months of captivity without bowing her head once, and who wore it now with the exact same posture she'd maintained throughout, like it had always been the correct destination for it. The hall was still. The entire assembled pack of Ashveil, the nobles and elders and ceremony guests and wolves who'd spent years calculating which direction to face. All of them watching this moment with the focused attention of people who understand they are watching something that will be described later. Atlas turned to face them, Nova beside him, the iron crown on her head. He sat on the throne. Not a performance, not a gesture. He simply crossed to it and sat down, the wolf pelt across his shoulders, his amber gold eyes moving across the hall with the patient, unhurried attention of something that has arrived at the place it was always supposed to be and is in absolutely no rush to justify it. The elder who had stood first rose again. Then the wolf beside her. Then the next. It moved through the hall in a wave, not dramatic, not performed. Just wolves standing, one after another, reading the room and the evidence and the iron crown and the man on the throne with the wasteland scars and the gold eyes, and making the oldest calculation a pack animal makes. Who is the real thing in this room? The answer was not complicated. Nova stood at the throne's right side, her freed hands at her sides, her chin at the angle it had maintained through 11 months of someone trying to lower it. She looked out at the hall with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for the room to catch up to a conclusion she reached some time ago. Atlas rested one hand on the throne's arm. Outside, through the keep's stone walls, and across the frozen distance of the wastelands, the territory that had made him stretch dark and vast to the horizon. It had taken everything he'd brought into it and returned him as something it couldn't keep. His brothers had bled him to build their future. He'd used the blood to build his own. The hearth fire crackled. The hall stood. The throne held the weight of the man finally sitting in it, and for the first time in 11 months, the keep was quiet in a way that meant something good. Nova's wrists would scar. She knew this already. She'd known it for months, the way you know things you live with long enough. The silver had done its work thoroughly, pressing into skin that wasn't built to tolerate it, day after day, in the particular cruelty of a punishment designed to remind rather than destroy. She looked at them now in the firelight, turned them over once, and then let her hands fall to her sides. Done, filed, finished. She looked at Atlas instead. He was still on the throne, not performing stillness, just inhabiting it, the way he inhabited everything, with that particular quality of presence that had nothing to prove, and therefore proved everything. The wolf pelt across his shoulders, the scars visible at his collar. The amber gold eyes moving slowly across the hall with the patience of something that had been forged in a year of absolute darkness and come out the other side knowing exactly what it was. He felt her looking. He turned his head and met her eyes, and the look between them was not dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was the look of two people who have said the important things already. In a cell corridor, in the dark, in the specific language of hands and silences, and the particular courage of staying present in a place that punished you for it. Everything that needed saying had been said before any of this began. He extended his hand. She crossed to him and took it, and he drew her down to sit at the throne's arm, and she let him, and that was its own kind of statement. Nova, who had spent 11 months refusing to be positioned by anyone, choosing her position now with complete authority. The pack remained standing. No one had given them permission to sit, and no one was going to, because what was happening in this hall had moved past the register of formal ceremony into something older. The wordless biological recognition of a pack that has found its actual center of gravity after years of orbiting a false one. They felt it the way wolves feel things, below language, in the chest. The elder in the front row looked at Atlas with an expression that contained an apology and a transfer of loyalty in equal measure. He received both without comment. He was not interested in extracting guilt from people who were choosing correctly now. The accounting was closed. What remained was the work. There was significant work. He knew this. The border raids, the wasteland territories, the rogue packs who'd been promised the raids would stop. 400 wolves standing in the exits of this building who had signed on for a specific outcome and would need to see it formalized, integrated, given the structural reality of actual policy rather than a battlefield promise. The pack records that needed restoring. The pages his brothers had removed. The history they'd tried to edit. The founding documents that established what the hybrid bloodline actually meant for succession. He knew all of it. He'd thought about all of it in the dark for 11 months. He would begin tomorrow. Tonight the fire burned, and Nova's hand was in his, and the hall stood, and the twin bodies of his brothers lay on the marble where they'd fallen, a fact that would need to be addressed practically in the morning, but which served for now as the clearest possible punctuation on the question of what this pack was going to be going forward, and who was going to determine that. Atlas looked at the crown on Nova's head, the iron one. The old bloodline crown that Caius had found insufficiently impressive. It looked correct. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. That specific expression. The one that had survived 11 months entirely intact. The one that said she'd noticed something and had opinions about it. "Don't," she said quietly. "I haven't said anything. You're about to say something about the crown. I was going to say it suits you." "I know," she said. "That's why I told you not to." Outside, the wastelands were dark and frozen and vast and completely indifferent to what had happened inside these walls tonight. They would remain so. That was the thing about the wastelands. They didn't care about thrones or bloodlines or the specific human theater of power and its transfer. They had taken a man who was bleeding out in the mud, and they had returned him as something the mud couldn't hold. He was grateful for that. In the particular way you are grateful for things that nearly killed you. Sura appeared in the main entrance, one of the few people in the room who had the authority of someone who had earned her presence here rather than inherited it. She met Atlas's eyes across the hall and gave him a single brief nod. Perimeter secure. Exits held. The night's work completed as contracted. He nodded back. She disappeared back into the corridor to manage her people, because Sura was, above all things, practical, and there would be time for the formal arrangements in the morning. There would be time for everything in the morning. Atlas looked out at the assembled pack one final time. Every face that had carefully not seen him for years, now seeing nothing else. Every wolf that had done the math on his dormancy and concluded it meant absence, now completing a very different calculation. He didn't make a speech. He'd said what needed saying. The room understood its situation. He let the fire speak for him. The great hearth at the hall's back wall burning steady and deep. The kind of fire that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to, because it is simply, undeniably, producing heat and light and the particular quality of permanence that distinguishes a fire that has found its fuel from one that is still looking for it. Nova leaned back against the throne's arm. Not performing comfort, actually comfortable, in the way of someone whose body has finally received information that the threat is over and is updating accordingly, slowly, bone by bone. His thumb moved across her scarred wrist. She didn't pull away. The crown caught the firelight and held it. They had spilled his blood to steal his Luna. They had not understood, could not have understood from inside the smallness of what they were, that the blood was the point, that the thing they'd tried to use to end him was the exact mechanism by which he became something they had no category for, that the Wastelands they'd used as a disposal site had been for 11 months a forge. You could not bleed a man like Atlas dry. You could only make him hungrier. The hearth fire crackled. The pack stood. The iron crown sat on the head of a woman who had never once bowed it, and the youngest triplet, the dormant wolf, the runt, the problem that had been walked out to the frozen mud and left for the scavengers, sat on the throne his brothers had killed 3 good men to keep from him. His eyes burned gold in the firelight, steady, patient, done waiting, home. They bled him to build their legacy. They left him in the mud to rot, and the Wastelands, cold, brutal, and completely indifferent to their plans, handed him back as a god. If you stayed until the throne was finally occupied, hit subscribe and join the hybrid empire. Drop a wolf in the comments if you knew from the moment that head hit the marble that Caius and Julian were already finished. The next story is already coming. And it is going to be ruthless. See you there.